Here we are for week 6 for World Civilizations to 1500. And last week we went to the Americas and we looked at Central America and the Mayan and Aztec civilization, and then we looked at the Incan civilization in South America. So at this point we've looked at, I think, all the major centers of the birth of civilization, where civilization began in each of these independent areas. Now we're going to move back to the Mediterranean and we're going to look at some secondary civilizations, because we have a layer of initial core civilizations that began at the initiation of civilization, and these eventually faded away and then gave way to other civilizations. So we'll be looking at the next generation, I guess you could call it, at this point. So tonight we're going to look at Lecture 11, The Glory That Was Greece. Okay. I wanted to start tonight by looking at an article that was in last Sunday's Sunday New York Times Magazine, September 9th, 2007. The name of the article was Defender of the Faith. The author was Mark Edmondson, and he was writing about Freud. Freud had long discussed religion and belief in God as a collective neurosis and a longing for a father. Freud was a notorious atheist, and he had no use for religion at all for most of his life. But toward the end of his life, he changed his mind. He published the last books. I didn't write down the name, unfortunately, but the last book he wrote, it was Moses and Monotheism. He argued in there that Moses was Egyptian and not Jewish, that he had derived monotheism from Akhenaten, and so that was a heresy that Jewish believers didn't like when he said that. But he changed his mind about religion and about Judaism. One of the things he said was that Judaism's distinction as a faith comes from its commitment to an invisible God. And he came to the conclusion that in conceiving God as invisible, as someone who could not be portrayed by images, the Jews, or the Kingdom of Israel, took a step that was a great advancement in the history of mankind. What he said was, this improves the capacity for abstraction, and so he traces the beginning of abstract thought, at least among the Hebrews, to the idea of an invisible God who had to be imagined instead of seen by images. He regards this as a triumph of intellectuality over sensuality, so it's an intellectual advance, describing God as symbolic and not in immediate terms, in the immediate experience. He said that the mental labor of monotheism allowed the future achievement in law, math, science, and the literary arts, all of these fields that need abstract thought. And he said that this passed from Judaism to the West. And furthermore, the idea of abstraction, that the idea of an invisible monotheistic God leads to, is control over nature and the humane order to life. Contemplation of an unseen God, moreover, leads to introspection, looking inside yourself to the interior world. And this means that this led to the invisible dynamics of the inner life and a better way to know yourself, your own character and desires and inhibitions and values. And this is particularly valuable in the modern world, where people do have to look at their own inner dynamics in order to survive, really, in modern life. So the ultimate end result is individualism. And I suggested to you in the lecture on the Hebrews that the rise of the prophets was also an example of the rise of individualism. And we saw that with Job. Looking at Job and he looks into his inner life and comes to the conclusion that he is right and all his friends are not. in looking at Job. So I thought this was interesting that it appeared, and it has something to do with our lecture tonight on the Jews, on the Greeks, as we're going to see. Okay, we looked at the Americas, and opposite to what Freud was saying about individualism and abstraction in the inner life among the Jews, the Americas, all the cultures of the Americas are the ultimate in communal societies, and really we saw very little individualism among the American societies. Now, is this a matter, is this because the sources are what they are, that we have no written sources for this time? Well, only partially, because we do have the Spanish observers who saw the Aztecs and the Incas and described their society in great detail. And these were described as the ultimate communal society. One thing we saw was the predominance of human sacrifice in all of these societies. And here we see a Mayan scene of human sacrifice. An Inca scene, this is the temple to the sun, and the Inca, of course, was the ultimate sun god, descended from the sun and a god himself. And here is the Inca, who was the head of that communal society. And as we saw, when the Spanish came and captured the Inca, and the same was true with the Aztec society, when the king of the Aztecs was defeated, then the Americans of various kinds were easily taken over. Okay, now we're going to move back across the Atlantic. Here we see our map of the New World. We looked at the Americas last time. Now we're going to move back to the Mediterranean for a second generation country, the Greeks. And here we see the Greeks in purple on the map, and it's circled. So this is what we're going to look at today. Okay, here is a close-up of Greece, and again, we have to look at geography. Geography has been very important in every single culture we've looked at. The geography of Greece was a significant shift of focus from the Near East. It's in an utterly different environment than we saw in the river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, or even the vast expanse of the Persian Empire. Something quite different, an island environment, not only an island environment in the middle of the sea, but also a very different land environment, because what we have on the peninsula of Greece that you see here in the orange is a very mountainous land with lots of individual valleys. And so what we see are an environment which encourages individualism, because we have isolated groups of Greeks going into the valleys and settling into the valleys, or settling on islands. And so the Greeks settle in this region, moving from the outside. They move from the north and they move into Greece, and they settle in very isolated areas. So they're separated from each other, and communication is not easy between the isolated groups. Among the Greeks, there's less interest in religious questions. And so what we see from the beginning of Greek culture is an interest in politics and in the organization of, if you want to call it the state or the government or the community, but that carries a much greater interest than the interest in religion. The focus of the Greeks is on the Aegean Sea, and the Aegean Sea is the center of that map, as you see it with all those yellow islands in it. And the orientation of the Greeks is toward the sea. But remember that the Greeks did not develop in a vacuum. Nobody developed in a vacuum, except maybe you can say the very, very, very earliest civilizations did. But after that, they all had some kind of contact with other cultures. Okay, here we see a map of Greece. And to emphasize this individualism of all the Greek city-states, this is a map of all the different city-states. They weren't unified. And often when we talk about the Greeks, historians will say, well, their great flaw is they could never unite. They fought each other all the time. The Greek word for stranger was the word for enemy. Okay? And so when they fought, all the city-states fought each other in civil wars constantly. There was rivalry, competition, and they were constantly fighting each other. And so we have these individual city-states among the Greeks. Okay, and here is the mountainous land. Here is Sardis, the city of Croesus, one of these Greek city-states. This one happens to be actually in Asia Minor, but it has that same kind of mountainous environment with the cities in valleys. And the other aspect of the environment is the Persian Empire. While Greece was growing, that was the very same time that Persia was dominant over all of the known world. So again, the Greeks did not develop in a vacuum. They had lots of neighbors that they were influenced by. And we'll see how they're influenced by that in a moment. Okay, the Greeks were an Indo-European society. They were a wave of migrants who had come from the Caucasus region between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And they were a wave that followed the Hittites. Remember, the Hittites were the first Indo-Europeans who settled in Asia Minor. Another wave settled in Greece. And even the Greeks came in waves of Indo-European invaders. First, there were 3 different waves, and we'll see them in a moment. It is a core Indo-European society. It's a warrior society. Okay, all the Indo-Europeans, nomadic societies, are warrior societies. And they had the same core social structure. The king was not absolute. He was an elected king or war leader, and he could be deposed if he didn't do a good job. They could throw out the king, so the king was not absolute. Characteristic of all the Indo-European societies is a council of elders, and usually they're heads of the families, and they're also called the aristocrats, but they're the sort of patriarchal heads of families coming together, the old men of the community who are a council of elders. And then under that layer of the aristocrats are the assembly of all free warriors. And in general, the ordinary men or the common men are warriors, and they're all free and they're all equal. Underneath that 3-layered society, we have the slaves. And usually the Indo-Europeans did not enslave themselves or within their own society. They enslaved people they conquered. Remember, they're a warrior society, so they would enslave, the slaves would be the conquered people among the Indo-European societies. Okay. Now, let's look at the Greeks. Here are some pictures of Greeks, and we'll be talking about some of these key Greeks in Greek mythology, which may be quasi-historical people. But the Greeks, with the Greeks, we see the emergence of heroes. And so it's a very strong characteristic of the Greeks to have heroic figures. What is a hero? How would you define a hero? Yeah.
Someone who transcends everyday human life and gives an example for, like the Romans, they didn't have a culture. When the Odyssey was written, it was an oral culture, and the people wanted, they didn't have photographs, so they wanted, their kilos, their glory, they wanted it to be, written, and the heroes are able to define them. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good definition of a hero. A hero is an example of what everybody aspires to. It's a sort of model for them to follow that they commemorate in their oral literature. And this is a time before they have writing, and so it's oral literature. It's an example of someone everybody wants to be like that, be like in that culture. A hero is the implication of something larger than life. A hero is not an ordinary person, but maybe someone who is better than everybody else in the society, a projection of our values on a superhuman scale. And a hero usually embodies what the whole society values. And every single society has heroes. We've seen one hero already. We've seen Gilgamesh. In the Mesopotamian culture, he served as a hero. He was an example of what people aspired to. We saw Ptahhotep in the Egyptian culture, who was vizier, and he was an example of somebody who climbed to the top of that society. We have heroes in our culture. Can anybody think of some of the heroes that we might have in our culture? Any examples of heroes? We actually have a lot of heroes in our culture. Yeah.
The flag raisers?
The who?
The flag raisers of Iwo Jima?
The flag raisers of Iwo Jima, yes, they certainly would be heroes that people admire and aspire to be like them, be heroic in that way. What other heroes can you think of? Can you think of one?
Daniel Boone and
Yes.
other people who fought at San Jacinto. And
Say that louder.
like the Stephen Austin and the other people that fought at the Alamo and stuff.
Daniel Boone, Stephen Austin, people who fought at the Alamo. Sam Houston might be one of those heroes as well. Okay, those are heroes, historical heroes. Who else? The first responders at 9/11, yes, a set of very modern heroes just in our own generation, and so they have been heroicized. Any other heroes? We have a lot of heroes in our culture.
The civil rights movement personalities, Rosa Parks.
Okay, the civil rights people, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., a very, very strong hero. Someone back there had an idea of a hero? Who did you think of?
Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, Abraham Lincoln, so we can have political heroes. Any other heroes that you can think of? We have a lot.
What about fictional heroes like Superman?
Superman. Superman is a great hero, yes, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. You know, we'd all like to be like Superman, Spider-Man. We have lots of heroes. So what do these embody? Nobody's mentioned sports heroes because we've had a lot of negative sports heroes recently who had feet of clay and who sort of disappointed us all. So sometimes sport figures can be heroes, and sometimes they're not if they fail in their example that they set for us. But we have a lot of different heroes in our society, and what they do is they reflect what we admire. Nobody mentioned any women. That's interesting.
Rosa Parks.
Oh, you mentioned Rosa Parks. Good, good. Any women heroes you can think of? No women? Yes.
What about Helen Keller?
Yes, Helen Keller would be a wonderful hero. She would be a great hero. Sally Ride, who was an astronaut, she would be a good hero. Any others?
I didn't think everyone would agree, but Oprah.
Oprah is a kind of hero. Yes, I think you can say Oprah is a kind of hero, a folk hero who everybody loves and admires. What about someone like Madonna or Britney Spears? Actually, there's a way in which one could think of Madonna as kind of admirable. I mean, she's very smart, and in a very calculated way, she got very famous and rich. So you could think of her as a kind of hero. What?
Mia Hamm, the soccer player.
Oh, Mia Hamm, a soccer player. Yeah, yeah. How about Margaret Thatcher? The first woman prime minister of Britain. Yeah.
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa is a wonderful hero, yeah. So we have a lot of heroes in our society, a lot of different models that we can follow to look at as the epitome of our society. The Greeks had a much simpler society, and they had a much simpler set of heroes. The Greek heroes included Achilles and Odysseus, and there were actually two great epics written about Achilles and Odysseus, and here is a picture of them. We see Thetia, Achilles, Eos, and Memnon here in this picture, Agamemnon. The Greek heroes were enshrined in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the Iliad and the Odyssey were to the Greeks what the Bible was to us, is to us, or was to us. The Greek society is a warrior society, and this means it is a shame society. It was not inward looking, but rather it was outward looking, and what mattered was the face you presented to the public, not what you felt or thought inside. What mattered was how you performed in public, and what kind of fame you gained, and what kind of heroic reputation you gained. Okay, the story of the Iliad is the story of the kidnapping of Helen. Here is a Greek woman at the very time when Helen would have lived. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships? Well, Helen was actually kidnapped by Paris, and she was taken to the city of Troy, which was across the sea, across the Aegean Sea in Asia Minor. Menelaus was the hero, was her husband, who launched all the ships to go get her, and the expedition was led by Agamemnon. And it was Homer who wrote about the expedition to Troy. The Iliad, and here's another picture of Helen with Greek warriors, Menelaus with Helen, and she is captured and taken to Troy. Okay, the Iliad, as we said, Menelaus was the leader, was her husband, and Agamemnon was the chieftain who led everybody off to war. Okay, Agamemnon took his ship and was journeying. For some reason, he had his youngest child, Iphigenia, with him, and he ran into terrible storms as he was sailing across the Aegean to go to Troy to bring Helen back to her husband. And in order to calm the storms and the gods, he sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to the gods. This was a terrible event that was going to cause trouble in the future. Okay, Achilles is the main hero of the Iliad, and the Iliad is, well, I used to say it's all nothing but battle after battle after battle. A lot of other things happen besides just the battles, but it's a 10-year war of the siege of Troy that takes place over, as I said, 10 years, written by Homer, and this is a bust of Homer, as you can see. Achilles was the Greek hero, and he represents individualism. He is a heroic individual. He fights in single combat, and he doesn't necessarily fight for the honor of Greece or Helen. He fights for himself, for his own glory and his own reputation. Hector, on the other hand, is a Mesopotamian kind of hero. He fights for the good of his city. He fights for Troy and to save the people of Troy. Odysseus is a minor hero in the Iliad. Later, he's going to become the major Greek hero because a change will happen in Greece. But in the Iliad, he's kind of a minor character. He's described as Odysseus of the many wiles, and so this shows an admiration of intelligence, cleverness, and deceit. But it's not the kind of intelligence, for example, when we talked about our heroes, nobody mentioned Einstein, who would have been a nice hero to mention. Odysseus did not have the kind of intellectual mind that Einstein or Freud or any of these intellectuals had. Rather, he was clever and witty and tricky, and he would often win by a trick rather than by brute force. And so he represents a change in Greek society. They admire something different. Instead of the brute force of Achilles, they then begin to admire the cleverness of Odysseus. Now we might talk about Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, as another hero, a woman hero that we can look at. And let's look at the story of Odysseus in the Odyssey. You have 2 readings in the Odyssey for this week. Odysseus wins by tricks. He wins by, for example, when he's captured in the cave of the Cyclops, he doesn't kill the Cyclops, he puts out his eye. The Cyclops has only one eye, but he sneaks his men out by tying them to the belly of the sheep. It's the bellies of the sheep, the underside of the sheep, and they sneak out through a trick, and that's how they get out of the cave of the Cyclops. That's the kind of hero Odysseus is, and in all the adventures he has, and I urge you to read the Odyssey. It's a wonderful book. He gets out of all these adventures by his wits and his cleverness. Penelope, his wife, is exactly like he is. She stays at home, and she's at home, and she is taking care of their property and their manor house and taking care of all their servants. But everybody thinks Odysseus is dead because he's sailing around the Mediterranean having all these adventures after the Trojan War, and they think he's dead, and so Penelope is besieged by all the suitors who come and try to force her to marry one of them. They say, you must marry one of these suitors because your husband is dead. And so Penelope, again, holds them off and keeps from marrying them, and she does this by a trick. She says that when I finish all my weaving, I'm weaving this great tapestry right now, and when I finish all my weaving, then I will marry one of you. And so all day long she would sit with her women at her weaving, and while the men would sit around drinking all her wine and eating all her food, and while they were in a drunken stupor at night, she would unravel everything she had woven during the day. So she put them off for about 20 years. And in the end, Odysseus came home, and he came home in disguise, and he tricked them all into revealing, all the suitors revealing their evil intentions, and he ended up besting them all and killing them all. So Penelope is a heroine similar to Odysseus. Well, is this all myth? Is this all mythology, heroic stories, or was it true? Yeah.
Wasn't it actually a shroud that she was weaving for Laertes, Odysseus' dad? Because she said, if this old man dies, what are people going to think that, Odysseus' wife didn't even make him a shroud? So.
Right, but this was an excuse. I mean, the point was she unraveled it at night when all the suitors were drunk, and so she was. There are lots of details I'm leaving out. We don't have time to talk about all the details, but this is the trick that she used. Well, was this true or was this not? We can go in archaeological investigations and we can check some of these stories. We know that the Mycenaean civilization is the civilization of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, well, let me mention one more thing before we go on. Here are some stories. Here is the sacrifice of Iphigenia, the young daughter who is sacrificed to the gods. And here is how the Trojan War ends. It ends with a trick. The Greeks do conquer Troy, and they do it by building this wooden horse, which they pull up to the gates of the city, and inside are hidden a lot of Greek warriors. And then the Greeks say, okay, we're going away, we're going home, we give up, we lost the war. Here is this horse for you people of Troy. And so the Trojans pull the horse into the city, and after they all go to sleep at night, the Greeks come out and they conquer the city. So they conquer Troy by a trick. Okay, so this is a symbol of what happened. Well, let's go back to this other one. Sorry. Okay. The Greeks of the Iliad and the Odyssey were the first wave of Greeks that came into the Aegean, and they were the Mycenaeans. They lived from 2000 to 1200 BC. When they got into the middle of the Aegean Sea, they encountered people who were already there, and these were the Minoans, who were there from 2500 to 1400 BC. The Mycenaeans are the people of the Trojan War, and they call themselves the Achaeans. So if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you see that they are called the Achaeans. The fall of Troy occurred in 1200 BC, and the Achaeans then absorbed the subject people of the Aegean Sea for the next 600 years, from 1800 to 1200 BC. This predominance of the Mycenaeans was, or the Achaeans, was ended by another wave of Greeks who came down into that area. These were the Dorians, who arrived in 1200 BC. So we have two waves of Greeks. First we have the Mycenaeans coming into this area, the heroic age of Homer, and then they were superseded by the Dorians in 1200 BC. At the same time, there were sea peoples in that region from 1800 to 1200 BC, at least some of whom were related to the Greeks. Well, is this all true, or is this mythology? Heinrich Schliemann, Sir Arthur Evans, and Michael Ventris all were archaeologists who wanted to test these theories. Everybody said it wasn't true, and the German Heinrich, I'm sorry, I spelled his name wrong, Heinrich Schliemann, went to the place where the Iliad said that Troy was. And at that exact location, he could actually track it down through the Iliad and the Odyssey and see exactly where it was located. And when he got there, lo and behold, he found a city with layer on layer on layer of remains. And he had found the historical Troy. Okay, there were other legends. There were legends about a civilization that was already there in that area, the Minoans. Theseus was a legendary king of Athens who went to the Minoan civilization, and there he found a King Minos at the labyrinth at Knossos in Crete. And in the middle of the labyrinth was a minotaur, a creature that was half man and half bull. And Theseus then defeated the minotaur in this in a great battle. Well, the Minoans were not Greeks. We know that for sure. Again, this was all thought to be legend. Sir Arthur Evans went to the location of Crete. He searched in that area, and he found remains. He found archaeological remains that were of a civilization that was not Greek. Okay, the Minoans were not Greeks because the civilization he found was not military, and perhaps it was matriarchal. It could have been a matriarchal civilization. They had a script, they had a written language, and it came in two forms, Linear A and Linear B, neither one of which was translated when Sir Arthur Evans found all this evidence of the Minoan civilization. They were not Greeks, remember. But this civilization was destroyed exactly in 1200 BC when the Dorians, another wave of Greeks, moved into this area. And this was exactly the same time that Troy was conquered and destroyed, 1148 BC. When this happened, Greece was plunged into a dark age for 3 centuries. Okay, now let's look at a little bit of the evidence. Here is a mound containing the 9 cities of Troy that were found by Heinrich Schliemann, and here we have all the cities of Troy that were excavated, and unfortunately in the 19th century they ruined some of them, and so we can't really see what they are. Here's a coin showing Theseus conquering the Minotaur. This is a Greek Athenian coin commemorating that legend. And here is the palace at Knossos in Crete that was excavated by Sir Arthur Evans. Lo and behold, it was a huge palace with lots of columns holding it up, and the inner part of it was a maze of different rooms, like a maze that wound in and out in a very hard area to discern. On the walls, and these are some other remnants of bull dancing that they practiced, athletes leaping over bulls in a sort of acrobatic formula, and evidence that women were at least equal in this society, if not superior. It could have been a matriarchy, but we aren't sure. Because we can't read their language. Okay, we can't read the writing that they left. All we can look at is the artwork, the frescoes on the palace, and statues like this of a Cretan lady or a goddess, a snake goddess she could be. And so this is what we have to go by. But the essence is that the legends are proved to have basis in historical fact. And if we look at the Minoans as a civilization on Crete that was not a military nation, they had a navy, but they were a commercial nation who traded all over the Mediterranean. They had no fortresses, they had no army, no defense, and they're here on the mainland of Greece. You have a militant military society of warriors who move into this area. What would you expect? That the destruction of Crete might have been because of the conquest by the Greeks. Well, I mentioned Michael Ventris on our list of people before that we looked at. Michael Ventris was a code breaker who worked in World War II to decipher Nazi codes, and he was very good as a code breaker. When the war was over, he went back to London and he started working on Linear A and Linear B. And lo and behold, he discovered that Linear B was a form of Greek. Okay, so here we have a non-military culture that suddenly disappears, is destroyed, and then we have Greek appearing, this warrior class in the Mediterranean. And so one of the conclusions we can reach is that the Greeks conquered the Minoan civilization. Here is the Minoan script. This is linear A, and here are some of the Cretan symbols, and we still can't interpret it. And here are the Greeks who have spread all over the Mediterranean at this point. They've conquered Crete, which is the island to the south in purple in this map, and Troy is on the right of this map on Asia Minor. Greece is the purple part to the left, and so this is the Greek conquest of the Aegean world. Okay. In an ancient wreck, there are clues to these seafaring lives. In the New York Times on March 27, 2001, there's an account of a discovery of an ancient wrecked ship that confirms Homer's accounts of the Mediterranean voyages in the Odyssey, that the Greeks traveled all over the Mediterranean. A ship was found near Cyprus that dated from about 300 BC, and it had a cargo of clay jars carrying wine, hundreds and hundreds of clay jars. So it was a merchant ship carrying wine. It was found in deep water and not along the coast, which is what a lot of historians thought. The Greeks never went out into the deep water, they just sailed along the coast. But this ship was found in deep water, and more finds in deep water show that the Greeks not only navigated around the shorelines, but also across the center of the Mediterranean Sea. The open water trading routes are now evident. Okay. Was Troy a metropolis? Homer isn't talking. Here's another New York Times article, October 22nd, 2002. Two German archaeologists are having a new Trojan War over whether Troy was a thriving commercial center or not, and the argument they had is about whether Troy was a huge metropolis and a trading center, and it got very violent. It's kind of funny, but the evidence is ambiguous, and the temptations are great to overinterpret. The problem with Troy is the mound has been occupied by successive cultures since 3000 BC up to 1200 AD. And so the article raises the question, are these two Germans who are slugging it out over whether Troy was a big city or not, are they a new Achilles and a new Hector? It's kind of a fun article. Here are the walls of Homeric Troy in a drawing, again looking at the ruins of Troy. Well, the article I started with today was about Freud, and in that same article, when Freud was looking at the Hebrew religion, there's a comment on Freud on the Greek gods. Freud says that one of the strongest human desires is to encounter God or the gods. We want to see our deities and to know them, and so he uses the example of the appeal of Greek religion, the gorgeous rendering of the immortals, to contrast with the invisible God of the Hebrews. Also among the Greeks, there's the possibility of meeting them on earth. What he doesn't say in this article, which I'm going to suggest to you right now, is that the Greek religion is a really interesting religion because it's so humanistic. And in the Greek religion, the gods exemplify human qualities writ large. And the Greek gods are not gods of weather. They're not gods of the Nile or gods of the mountains or gods of the storm. They're gods of human emotions, human achievements, and even human foibles. Okay, you had, and here are some of them. Here are the gorgeous rendering of them. Zeus is a kind of chairman of the board. And you have it's like the Council of Elders that rule the Greek military state. You have all the gods meet in a great council, and Zeus is the head of that council, and he's not an absolute head of all the gods. So the Greek gods reflect Greek society. Here is Hera, who is the wife of Zeus, and she often goes against her husband, tricks him, does things that he doesn't like. She's a very strong woman. She's kind of interesting as a goddess. Okay, and here is the birth of Athena. She is born from the head of Zeus, not in the normal way of human birth, and she becomes the great goddess. She's a warrior goddess, the goddess of Athens. Okay. Here is Athena, Hephaestus, Poseidon, the god of the sea, Apollo, who's a god of war, and Artemis from the east frieze of the Parthenon. So here are the Greek gods. they look just like human beings, don't they? They're very much in the same image of the humans who created these Greek gods. The Greek creation story, which you had for your readings for tonight, what are the gods like? Well, the main god is Gaia, Mother Earth, and most of the gods are born in the normal human way from Gaia. She actually gives birth to all these children. The Greek gods are just like humans. They're a mirror of Greek society. Gaia is Mother Earth. She's a mother. She bears all the beings, the other gods, in love or hate. And human emotions are represented. Very early is the emotion of eros, or love, who is the object of desire of all human beings. The father is Oronos, or heaven, and he embodies hate and anger and vengeance. And the story ends with the sons, or at least the story we're reading, with the sons castrating him. But from him is born Aphrodite, the goddess of love, or more specifically, if you read it carefully, she's the goddess of seduction and charm and delight. It's not an esoteric kind of high emotion of love like for all mankind, but it's human love. I mean, it's love like sex. It is what we see in all of this. So this is characteristic of all the Greek gods. The gods live on Mount Olympus, and here is Mount Olympus, which is an actual place in Greece. And this is where the gods live, and here are some of the different Greek gods. Again, they take human form. Here's Diana, the goddess of the hunt, Poseidon, the goddess of the sea, Hygeia, the goddess of health. And so very many of these gods and goddesses are of human characteristics. Okay, oracles and orgies are also a characteristic of Greek religion. You had one of your readings is about orgiastic Bacchic rites, in which women engage in wild orgiastic sex. Dionysius is another orgiastic religion of the Greeks, which is associated with wine drinking and drunkenness. And let me remind you that wine and sex represent altered states of consciousness. And what is religion? What is religion? Ecstasy, but an altered state of consciousness. And so they're taking these indulgences in wine and sex as ways to have religious experiences. They're out-of-mind experiences. Another article in the New York Times, March 19th, 2002, for the Delphic oracle, Fumes and Visions. The oracle was always a woman, and she had visions, and she went into a trance or a frenzy, and she could foretell the future. The oracle at Delphi was excavated and investigated, and it was found to be a place where petrochemical fumes were oozing up from underground, and it did indeed put people into a trance or a frenzy. And so the oracle is not a myth, but it's a result of a natural experience. Here is Dionysius, the rites of Dionysius, which involve drunkenness and sex. And this is the society that we're looking at. Well, what we know about the Greeks is that they're famous for democracy, right? But the society we've looked at so far was a society in which kings rule. They're elected kings, but they're still kings. Over this period of time, in the Mycenaean Age and into the Dorian Age, the king was eliminated. And this happened during the Dark Age. Remember that in 1200, when Troy fell and Crete fell at the very same time, the Greeks were plunged into a dark age for 1200 years, and it was during this dark age that the kings were eliminated and the Greek polis and democracy developed. Well, what happened to kingship? We can tell a little bit from examining the sources. This is a megaron I'm showing you, which is a king's palace. This is the Lion's Gate, the entrance to the king's palace. We've looked at characteristic buildings of, for example, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. We've looked at temples. We've looked at tombs. We've looked at buildings of mostly religious buildings It's interesting that the megaron, the Greek building, is the palace of a king. It's not a religious building, and it's the basic structure of the king. Over the period of the Dark Ages, when we have no written record of the Greeks, the name of king changed. At the beginning of that period, the king was called Anax, which is more or less an absolute king. At the end of the Dark Ages, we see the rise of a different name for king, which is Basileus. In Linear B, he's an underling. An Anax is an overlord, a Basileus is an underling, but when they emerge from the Dark Ages, the Basileus has come to fill the role of king. The chief function of the king was leadership in war, to consult the council of elders, and to oversee the religion and dispense justice. By the end of the Dark Age, we enter the Archaic Age, in which the king tends to be replaced by the heads of clans. This is a period that is called aristocracy, and the king is overthrown, and now we have a council of elders ruling. The aristocracy rule. This is also called oligarchy. The aristocracy is, by definition, a rule of people who are superior by their birth. They have inherited status within their society, and they inherit their role as the head of the Greek clans. By the end of the Dark Age, the aristocracy is in control. But then as we enter the next Greek period, classical times, we see the extension of rule by birth to other classes, and this is the first step on the road to democracy. Okay. What happened was essentially a wave of colonization that happened from 800 to 550 BC. Greece prospered, they did well, and they suffered from overpopulation. So what did they do about overpopulation? Well, instead of conquering each other or killing off their excess, they solved it by overseas colonization, and they spread out through the entire Mediterranean world. When they did this, they founded colonies on all the shores of the Mediterranean, and so trade developed between the colonies and the mother cities. And when they went out to colonize from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, they encountered other people and other ideas. And one of the ideas they found was coined money. Before coined money, people traded with bits of metal, and they just sort of chopped it up and weighed it, and that's how the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, for example, traded. The Lydians in Asia Minor were they might have been Hittite, but they were in Asia Minor, and they invented coined money, which is the measuring of metal in a precise weight and then stamping it with an image. So the invention of coined money meant a huge increase in trade and in the prosperity of the whole Mediterranean world. Think about it for a minute, because coined money is a great development of trade. It makes trade so much easier if you have coins. And coins are used for all sorts of useful things. We'll talk about that in a moment. And with the increase of trade, because of the colonies and now the use of coined money, we have a new commercial class rising. Instead of just having foot soldiers and an aristocracy, now we have a third class introduced, and this is a class of merchants as a result of this colonization and trade. And also a sense of new Hellenic unity, that the Greeks all feel that they're all Greeks because they speak the same language. The products that they trade in are wine and olive oil, and so you see specialization in these products of trade goods, wine and olive oil, and also the invention of pottery, which is a very large trade, a very large item of trade, geometric pottery. And at the end of this period, in 550 BC, we see the reintroduction of writing, and the reason we do is because they came in contact with the Phoenicians, who had invented the alphabet. The Greeks quickly adopted it, and all of a sudden we see the reintroduction of writing in Greek society. And here you see a typical geometric vase with the use of that in trade. Here are the colonies, some of the colonies of the Greeks just around the Aegean and in Italy and Sicily. You can see here the spread of those colonies and all around the Black Sea and all around Asia Minor. And here you see on the large map of the Mediterranean, they went all the way to southern France, and so you see them all over the Mediterranean. Okay, here are olive trees, the cash crop of antiquity, and here are the first coins, the earliest coins for the development of coinage. These are very good for the promotion of government too, because you could use these images on coins for propaganda to promote the predominance of the king, or to use it for propagandistic purposes. Here is the reintroduction of writing. This is early Greek writing. Most of the Greek writing is in inscriptions on stone, but here is the earliest book, which I've shown you also earlier. Okay, there's also a lot of cultural change within the Greek society. Here you see on the left an archaic Greek statue from the Archaic Age. On the right you see an Egyptian statue. The Greeks were very stylized. They were not naturalistic at all during the Archaic Age, but if you look at the Egyptian statue, it's very humanistic and realistic, and so the Greeks may well have learned their use of realistic sculpture from the Egyptians. Here are early Greek ships. Here's a Greek ship on the left and a Phoenician ship on the right. They're all plying the Mediterranean at this point, and here's a 50-oared Greek ship in this trading. Now, a new commercial class means they have a new set of values. They have a new set of values. Their culture changes. Draco of Athens writes down the laws in 620 BC, and by 360 BC, writing was widespread. We see a new set of values. A new commercial class means new values. Instead of being competitive with each other as they were in the Iliad and the Odyssey, now they cooperate. And this is partly due to the development of the phalanx. A phalanx is a military unit where all the Greek soldiers work together and step in unison and guard each other together. And so the movement is from competition to cooperation and dependence. Okay. Now, because of the rise of the commercial class, all of a sudden there are a lot more wealthy people, and this is part of the introduction of coinage, so that the census is to count the people to serve in the military, but there's a change. Instead of counting people according to their birth and whether they're aristocratic, people start to be organized according to their wealth. And this results in the extension of citizen rights, that citizens can be citizens not because they're born to be aristocrats, but wealth can make them more equal. We also see the rise of tyranny and tyrants. A tyrant is a Lydian word for king, and we see the introduction of the word tyrant. What happens is, because of the rise of the new commercial class, before they get their rights, they start agitating for equal rights and power in the government. And there are uprising among the city-states, popular uprising for the rights of the people. There are great arguments. The best people are the aristocrats, and they argue that they should rule. The masses argue that we should have rule by democracy, and one of your readings has to do with that, the argument about which is the best form of government. What happens is there are rebellions among the cities, and for temporary rulers, tyrants take over. They're temporary rulers who are put in charge by the people, and the tyrants, they're called tyrants because it's the Lydian word for king, and they're fine as rulers who the people have put in place as long as they're alive. But what happens when they die? Okay, there's no machinery for replacing them. And that's how democracy rises. It rises as a reaction to the rise of tyrants, and here we have tyrants who tend to be killing each other. There are new rules so that we have rule by the people. Okay. Now, the best people are the aristocrats. We move from an oligarchy of an aristocracy, ruled by aristocracy, to democracy, ruled by the people. And there's a lot of debate among the Greeks about which is the best form of government. One of these you're reading, Herodotus's Persian dialogue, a debate on the different forms of government. Okay. And here are all the individual city-states, each of them developing differently, but each of them having characteristics in common. And let's move to Athens and Sparta, looking at some examples. The Peloponnesian War was from 430 to 404 BC, and it was a war of Athens against Sparta. The propaganda of this war fixed our impression of Athens and Sparta because there was a huge amount of propaganda. Athens and Sparta represent the two extremes of Greek values, but they both represent Greek values. Sparta was concerned with raising people according to moral standards. Sparta was the only Greek state that concerned itself with the well-being of its people. And Sparta was the first great state of Greece, and here it's actually in the Peloponnese, which is the lower island on this map. Sparta, or Laconia as it's also called, was a Dorian state. And the Dorians were that next wave of Greeks who came down into the Greek peninsula. The Dorians, when they moved into the Peloponnese, enslaved the native population, and the Spartans called them helots, or slaves. In 700 BC, Sparta attacked the Messenians, or Messenia, one of these city-states, which is the yellow city-state on your map. Sparta is the purple in the center of the Peloponnese, and Messenia is the yellow just below that, if you can see. Sparta attacked Messenia and doubled its territory and enslaved the population at a time when other Greek states were colonizing. Sparta solved its problem by conquest of the Peloponnese. In 620 BC, the Messenians revolted, and the Spartans showed determination to hold on to its territory, and this fostered military traditions. When the Messenians revolted, the Spartans threw away every part of their society but military organization. The Spartans ruthlessly suppressed any tendencies other than the military, and Sparta became a military state, a land-based power based on its army. And I can't show you any pictures of Spartan buildings or Spartan arts because they didn't have any. They didn't have any literature, they didn't have any art, they didn't have any architecture, they didn't have any trade. All they did was have an army, and that was their big achievement. The constitutions of the Lacedaemonians are called the laws of Lycurgus. And here is the Spartan plain. The Spartans were Dorian, and they conquered the Helots. They called their laws the eunomia, or the good laws, the laws of Lycurgus, and they called themselves the homoioi, or the equals. Everybody was equal in Sparta, and they were all part of this military society. The constitution of the Lacedaemonians, we have the eunomia, the good laws. Everybody was a homoioi. They were all equals, and they focused on military training. Okay. There was military training for the men from age 7 to age 40. They all lived in barracks, and the young children were trained to a life of hardship. They were starved, they were given insufficient clothing, they were sent out in the woods to live, and to live by stealing from the slaves and the helots. This was to harden them, and so that they could bear the extremes of heat and cold and starvation and become big, tough soldiers. They married at the age of 18, and one of the interesting things is in the Spartan society, women were quite equal. Women were raised to be childbearers and to bear good soldiers, and so they were allowed to be athletic, and they were trained to be very healthy, and to encourage their men to go out and fight hard. And this is where the saying that the Spartan women had to their soldier husbands and sons, "Come home with your shield or on it," so that they should die rather than come home in disgrace. the education of children was entrusted to 5 ephors, and all Spartans were parents to all children. The children were raised in common. Okay. They had, it's a very simple government. They had a council of elders called the Gerousia, which was all the men over 60. Do you recognize something familiar about that name, Gerousia? Geriatric, yes, exactly, geriatric. It's old men, it's the elder men. The assembly is the appella, and you recognize appellate court that we have in our language today. The appella is the assembly of all men over 30, and you have a description of Spartan government. Xenophon talks about the laws of Lycurgus and the government of Sparta. The 5 ephors oversee the educational system. This system fostered discipline, coordination, and dependability. Well, did it work? Well, yes, they had the best army in all of Greece, but on the other hand, when any Spartans got outside of Sparta, they regularly misbehaved. There was no money in Sparta, well, there was money. I mean, they had no coinage in Sparta. The money was great big rocks. So that if anybody gathered a lot of wealth, you could see it right away if you have a pile of rocks, which is your money. And so they tried to keep everybody equal within the society. Okay. In 546, at the Battle of Tegea, the Spartans won but could not incorporate more land. Instead, they made a defensive alliance, and here they formed the Peloponnesian League, also called the Lacedaemonian League, and Sparta became the great power of Greece. It was a land-based power based on its army, and it was the Spartans who faced the Persians in the Persian invasions from 499 to 479. Sparta was the core of the resistance against Persia, but a change happened because the resistance was led by Athens. Athenians took the lead and won the great sea battle of Marathon in 480, and this changed the balance of power to Athens. Okay, now what about Athens? Athens was not a Dorian city. Remember, the Spartans were Dorians. Athens was an Ionian city, and the Ionians were another wave of Greeks who came down into that area, again from the Caucasus, another wave who moved into the area of Greece. Athens had an opposite development. They developed democracy and a very much more elaborate form of government. Athens was a sea-oriented state. They raised a great navy against Persia, and colonizing solved their overpopulation, so they became the center of a great sea network. Athens' military security depended on its fleet, and Athens was one of the foremost colonizers, and they formed commercial ties to all their colonies. And so Athens developed a large and wealthy commercial class, but only the old land-based aristocrats had power. So how were we going to solve the new wealthy class in Athens? Well, at first in Athens, the classes were divided by property, and the richest people were 500 bushel men who had the wealth over 500 bushels. There were other classes, and they counted their wealth according to bushels of grain, and this means they were based on agriculture and land. The reforms of Solon, and here are Athens colonies, when we say Athens colonies, the reforms of Solon led to democracy. In 594 to 3, Solon was archon of Athens, and an archon is like a mayor. He instituted the reforms that led to democracy. He reoriented Athens to the changes of the 6th century and the rise of the commercial class, the new values of cooperation. Okay, there was social discontent. The commercial class was agitating for power. The rich merchants had wealth but no power. Solon chose to head off a revolution because of his extensive commercial ties. Okay. What Solon did was reorient Athens to the olive plant, which was the cash crop of antiquity, and henceforward Athens had to import its grain. Solon opened up Athenian citizenship to skilled artisans from other cities, And in the Greek cities, if you weren't, you had to be born in the city to be a citizen of it. Solon changed that. He said, if you were rich, if you were clever, if you were talented, and you came to Athens, you could be a citizen. So what did this mean? The most talented, the most ambitious, the most hardworking people all over Greece flocked to Athens, where they could become a citizen. It was extraordinarily successful. The other change that Solon made was to make 1 bushel equal to 1 drachma, and the drachma was the coin, the coinage. And so if a bushel was equal to a drachma, you didn't have to carry around 500 bushels. You could carry around 500 little drachmas and be rich. And merchants, their wealth was in coins. It was not in bushels. So this meant that wealth was no longer based on land or the production of bushels of grain, but it's based on wealth or the coinage. Solon also introduced the Helea, or the popular courts, and all citizens were eligible. These courts had the right of appeal from the magistrates' acts. Now, what happened? How did democracy come to Athens? All of these changes weren't enough to bring democracy. It was an economic accident. What happened was so much wealth was pouring into Athens, there was enormous inflation, and soon everybody was a 500 bushel man. Everybody became equal because inflation made them all equal in their wealth. And so this is what democracy grew out of. Athens was now ruled by 2 archons. An archon is like a mayor, and the archons were elected, chosen from the 2 highest classes. The boule was the council of elders, and they elected 400 people in the boule, 100 from each of the 4 tribes of Athens. They prepared members for the ecclesia. Okay, the ecclesia. I'm sorry, I spelled that wrong. I think there's only 1 S in it. The ecclesia was the assembly of all propertied citizens, and it meets once every 10 days. The Areopagus was the high court of law, and on the high court, it's kind of like a Supreme Court. On that high court, all the ex-archons served. Again, the Helea were the popular courts, and all citizens over 30 served in the Helea, and the Helea heard appeals from decisions of the archons. Okay. This was modified by Cleisthenes, and here we have a kind of timeline of the different events. These were modified by Cleisthenes, who created different classes and divided it up and changed the government and made it more democratic. The results were a new spirit of zeal and cooperation. The citizens of Athens saw themselves as ruled by the isonomia, or the equal laws, and concern was with due process. Everybody was equal under the law. Well, the Persian Wars happened from 499 to 479. It was a clash between the expanding Persian Empire, ruled by Kurush the Great and Dariush, and the expanding Greeks. Okay. At the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, Europe was saved from Eastern control. That's sort of what you hear passed down from the 19th century. In reality, remember that the Persians were also Indo-Europeans. They weren't that different from the Greeks. They could talk to each other, and Persia had a lot of exchanges with Greece. The upshot of the Persian Wars, but they're just, they're Indo-Europeans. They're fighting each other. There's so much competition, and they're constantly fighting with each other. But the upshot of the Persian Wars was that there was a desire to maintain the confederacy among the Peloponnesians, and there was an idea of a need for a larger unit of government. But Sparta had been weakened, and it was unable to continue the leadership. Leadership was taken up by Athens, and Athens formed the Delian League to carry on the war against Persia. The Delian League of all the city-states of Greece became the Athenian Empire. And Athens then collected taxes from them all for the common defense. But Athens started to use the income from the Delian League to run the city of Athens. They were democratic within the city of Athens, but not among the other people of the Delian League. Pericles was the great ruler at this time, who ruled, and here are the warriors, so you can see the Greek warriors. Okay, Pericles was the great leader of Athens at this time, and he took the money from the Delian League and he used it to turn Athens into the wonder of the Greek world, a beautiful city of art and architecture and great development of all kinds. You have two readings on Pericles. Thucydides writes the history of the Peloponnesian War, and we have the funeral oration of Pericles, where the Athenians are discussed as citizens. Here is the city of Athens, built on a hill, a city of marble, a city of art. This is the Acropolis in the background, the Temple of Theseus in the foreground. Here's the Temple of Athena Victory, again built with the proceeds from the Delian League. The city of Athens is glorified. Art exploded and bloomed everywhere. Here you see this example of typical Greek art. How would you describe this art? What are its characteristics of Greek art? This is typical of Greek art. Yeah. Very realistic. Okay. Does everybody agree that this is very realistic art? Is any human being this perfect? What do you think?
I'm gonna say it looks stiff and too still and everything's.
It's too perfect. What do you think? Press your mic.
It's idealized.
It's very idealized. It's very idealistic art. Yes, it's realistic, but it's realistic to the point where it's idealized, so that it's so realistic that nobody is that perfect. Nobody is that good. And this is typical of Greek art. It's not exactly realistic. It's very ideal. Here's some more examples of Greek art, this time shown in a vase painting in pottery. By the way, the Menil collection has an absolutely splendid collection of Greek art, both pottery and very early archaic Greek art. So if you want to see some Greek art, go to the Menil collection. It's free. It's wonderful. Here's a Greek vase. This vase painting is incredible, the kind of art that they develop. Athens becomes the Paris of the ancient world. The theater becomes very prominent. The theater is developed from the Dionysian religion. The theater acts out some of the morality plays. They actually act out the mythology, and they consider it in a new way. So here's a theater that is developed usually in a natural amphitheater, so that the seats are down a hillside into a valley, as you can see here. The Peloponnesian War was from 430 to 404 BC. It was total war between Athens and Sparta. Both sides were suing Persia for military aid, and Persia started pouring gold into the Spartan side. No part of the Greek world remained untouched. It was a civil war between Athens and Sparta. In 384 BC, at the King's Peace, Persia dictated the terms to Greece, and this war determined our images of Athens and Sparta because of the vigorous propaganda war waged by both Athens and Sparta. And here we see Athens before the war, and after the war, the expansion of Athens. Again, Athens grew rich. Here is Athens again, a thriving commercial city, and the restoration of the Acropolis on the top of Athens. Both Athens and Sparta represent typical Greek concepts. This is the restoration of the Parthenon. Sparta represents the responsibility of the citizen to the state and the state to the citizen. Athens represents the creative role of the citizen in the state and the freedom of the individual. Both Athens and Sparta represent the same ideals of Greek government, but they take completely different forms in the two different city-states. So one of the things that we can see among the Greek city-states is the constant tension between the individual and the community. Athens focuses on, or Sparta focuses on the community and the common good, everybody working for the good of the community. Athens represents the development of the individual within the community. And so we see both these ideals represented in the Greek city-state. Okay, I'm running a little bit behind, but that's okay. I'll try to squeeze it all in. It's about time for us to take our break, and when we come back, I want to look at the Greek mind and the events that lead up to the disintegration of this Greek culture, and it ends up with the rise of a conqueror for the whole region, Alexander the Great. And so when we come back, we'll look at how the Greek city-states sort of dissolve and how a savior ruler comes and takes over to save them all. Okay, let's take about a 15-minute break. This is